So I'm going to talk a lot about continuous deployment today. Just to be upfront and honest, I work at Lucid Software. We haven't quite hit our definition of continuous deployment yet, but we've made a lot of strides. So I started off at Lucid about 4 years ago now, and we were about 40 people total in the entire company. This last year we hit 400 people in our company. And so changing the way we deploy our product was a monstrous task with that many people to have to work with. And so just to give you some context, like, it was a big deal. So where we were, we work on a 2-week sprint cycle, and we would deploy code every other week, basically. Like, we would deploy all of our services all at once, every other week. And we would cut our release candidate branch every Monday morning, well, every other Monday morning at 9 a.m. We would have to do regression testing on it. If you don't know what regression testing is, I will explain it later, but just know it's one of the most painful things about my job. And the less we have to do it, the better is the goal here. And during that whole time, whenever we had issues with the release candidate branch, we would have to fix them like on the fly, really quick, really fast, so that we could get to our Thursday release at 2 p.m. and hit that deadline. Didn't always happen. I'm assuming anyone who's ever worked in the release cycle understands sometimes you miss that deadline for a lot of reasons, and it can get pretty hectic because you know that's the time you want to hit. And then we would just spend the other week just, on a normal build new features, fix bugs, try to merge it to the master branch and get it out to our users. So this is where we were, and we've been here since I started at the company, for ages and ages. And it's always been a dream to we'll get to continuous deployment. And so just to understand our cycle a little bit better, this is a very, very high overview. There's a lot more that goes into our release. And at the time, we would have our engineers develop on a specific branch, and once that branch was ready, it would get merged to our giant master branch. And we had, I think when we started this project to get to weekly deploys, we had about 60 to 70 engineers deploying code at any time to the master branch whenever they want. And so it was really hard when something broke on the master branch to go back and say, I wonder who broke that one. And so QA would do all of their tests on the master branch at this time. And then once QA found a bug, they would report it. The dev would have to build a whole new branch, fix the bug, and then ship that to the master branch for QA to again test to see if the bug actually worked. And that cycle could just go on and on and on. And then eventually, again, we would cut the release candidate from master at 9 a.m. on Monday. Whatever ended up on master at 9 a.m. on Monday, that was on the release candidate. And so I shudder to think of how many things were merged at 8 a.m. on Monday, very frequently at the last minute, let's get it out there and see what happens. Still gives me a little bit of nightmare. And then we would regression test on that release candidate, we would fix the blockers, and just merge it to production, cross your fingers, hope it works. Obviously that had a lot of problems with it if we wanted to get to weekly deploys. It didn't really make sense to do it this way anymore for weekly deploys. Testing just on the master branch, no testing beforehand, means we have to wait on builds so much. It was ridiculous. And it just meant more problems down the line. So we learned we need to get to testing sooner. And whenever we cut the release candidate branch at 9 a.m. on Monday, we could still be in the middle of that cycle of trying to fix bugs on these massive new features and seeing what happens. And so like we would still be testing the massive new features on the release candidate that was definitely going out on Thursday, and hope that worked. And it was just a really long feedback cycle. And finally, like the regression testing itself. And so the regression is a suite of tests, basically, where if you've never used Lucidchart or LucidPress before, they are very, very visual products. Like there's about 1 million different use cases, and then we have users from all sorts of backgrounds. So trying to test to those use cases, very difficult. And so it took 7 of our full-time manual testers who know the product inside and out, 3 full days and often a little bit of overtime just to get this regression suite done. It was massive, and I'll go into why it was so massive pretty soon. And then again, we merged everything to production, and that was over 70 developers of work for 2 whole weeks. Like, I know this sounds, I'm getting like a lot of looks, like, oh man, how did this work? And so we set a goal in September of last year, like we want to make this better. This isn't the way it should be anymore. And so we set the goal. So we want to get to continuous deployment eventually, but in the meantime, we want to get to weekly deploys somewhere in there. And so we set up a team. I was a part of that team. There were quite a few people on it to determine the best way to get to a weekly deploy and what we needed to do. And so a lot of that involved considering the people, the obstacles, the timeline, and what kind of tools we needed to actually get there. So let's start off with the people then. So I really like Lord of the Rings. So there might be a lot of puns in here, and I'm sorry if you don't get all of them. Let's start off with our head of engineering, who kind of started this whole quest for us. He's been with the company since the start, basically, and like his dream has always been continuous deployment, and so he knew he wanted us to get there somehow. And so he's the one who said, let's do this, even though he wasn't there the entire time, whenever like a part of the team, but he was always watching over and making sure we were getting there. Then you have our DevOps crew, really, really amazing, hardworking developers who built so many things to make weekly deploys possible, to make the builds better, to make us working with Jenkins. Oh, we use Jenkins. And yeah, to make that better, like 1 million different things they did. We have all of the engineers, so all those 70 people deploying different code to either Lucidchart, to LucidPress, to our backend, to our data service, like to everything, that we had to make sure we're all on board with this, because if they're not on board, it's not going to work. We had our quality assurance team, which at the time, that was my team, was about 10 people, and we knew like if we wanted to do this, like that wasn't enough. So we had to get all of the quality assurance on board, because they're the ones who are going to have to be testing every week to make sure this is possible. We had to get our product managers on board, and they loved it. Our product managers absolutely adored the idea of getting to continuous deployment, because I think every product manager's dream is to have a feature, think it out, build it, and just have it out there for the user as soon as possible. Like the sooner the better a feature can get out there. So they were 100% on board, probably the easiest people to convince, like, we can do this. They were like, yeah, we can. And then finally, this was also me. We needed a release coordinator or a manager. And this is the person who like kind of carried a big chunk of the burden every week to make sure the release actually happened. So we didn't really have a ton of formalized process around our release before this, and so we actually I made up my title, it was great, of a release coordinator, to have someone actually in charge every week to make sure all the like checkbox items got done every single time we've released. All the builds are passing, all the automated tests are passing, everything is done for the regression, everything just works. And if I had one recommendation, make sure you have a backup as well. Don't just put this on one person. Make sure there's multiple people. Without some kind of redundancy in this role, that person will get burnt out really, really fast. So if you're just starting down this line, like, make sure you have multiple people who know how to do this. Ideally, even a whole team who can do this. So let's talk about the obstacles for a second. Our first obstacle was our arduous deploys. So we would start the release to production. We would start releasing all of our, I think, 20 services to production at 2 p.m. And sometimes I would be there till 7 p.m. Hoping that everything got deployed and worked, because sometimes we would release, see something wrong, roll back, fix it, release again, and like that cycle is just very painful if you've ever lived through it. So getting past these arduous deploys was probably the first real beast we had to tackle. And that was a lot of DevOps work. Like, they put in so much effort to make sure our deploys started running smoothly. The next was some nasty habits. I can't do the voice, sorry. And this one is a huge thing. If you're in a larger organization, larger than like 50, where you don't actually know everyone anymore because it's really hard to know more than 50 people, then like you're going to have some bad habits that you have to break. So one of our worst habits was, ownership, I think is the best way to phrase it. So whenever we had those blockers, and a blocker is an issue that would hold the release. So any issue that would, yes, this is going to hold the release, we need to get it fixed before we release to production. So owning those blockers, and we would have quite a few because it's a big product. Like, a lot of different things could go wrong anytime we released. And so trying to make sure whenever we had a blocker and we gave it to the engineer who knew the most about that area of the product, whatever it was, that they were on board to fix it. Like, they may not have necessarily caused it, but they needed to be on board to fix it. And trying to break that habit of, like, well, I didn't cause it, so I'm not going to fix it, was kind of hard. But once we had a very open conversation with all of engineering, talking about this and like addressing people's questions, like, I found out if you treat people like an adult, like, they're a lot more likely to listen to you. And so whenever we addressed it with the whole organization and talked to them, we got pretty much every single engineer on board. Like, yeah, if I get assigned a blocker, I'm going to own it, I'm going to take it, I'm going to make sure it gets fixed. And then finally, the big nasty regression testing. So again, this took 7 manual testers 3 days to do, which is huge. Like, that's a lot of man hours in order to make sure our product is working before we release. And that's what the regression does. It makes sure we don't regress in our product if you don't know what it is. And so once we laid out what our obstacles were, we started with a timeline. So this started in about September of last year, that we really wanted to accomplish this big goal. And to make that timeline, we used SMART goals, which are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound. So I would highly recommend using SMART goals, whether you're setting them for yourself personally or whether you're doing it with your whole engineering organization. So our goal was be at weekly deploys by the end of the year, so December 31st, with service A, B, and C. So we have 20 different services in automatic continuous deployment. So basically, what that means, if you hit the merge and you're developing on one of these services and you hit the merge button from your pull request, it goes to production. Like, it was crazy. And so now that we had our timeline, we needed to start actually doing the work and getting the tools out there. And so we created a lot of tools to make this possible. The first was moving team machines to AWS. So before, all of our testers would work off of actual laptops for their environments and like hope that was good. And it was very slow because it doesn't have a lot of efficiency there. And so we actually moved all of our team machines over to Amazon Web Services because that's where our product lives. It's in AWS. So like that's where it should be. Like why aren't we testing in the same thing that our users are using? And that brings me to my next point is actually having production-like environments. If you don't have production-like environments, this should be like your first big goal to get to continuous deployment, because if your developers can't check their code on an environment that actually mimics production, you're going to miss big issues. And that's what like we saw, or if your testers can't test on an environment that actually matches production. One example of this is our product is very reliant on templates. So like our users can just click on a template, choose it, and like go, like and start creating something. But we didn't have any templates in our testing environments. Like we couldn't play with the templates at all. And like we had to change that. We had to get the templates in the testing environment, and that's where AWS came in, because like we couldn't support all the templates on just running it on a machine. Like we had to get it in AWS. And finally, we also had lots and lots of environments. We have over 30 testing environments for people to just jump on and use whenever they want. Next up, we built our own internal tool called Sentinel. This was a lot of work on one developer's part who was very determined to make, if you wanted to get a specific branch on a specific environment, make that as easy a process as possible, instead of like trying to finagle it for 30 minutes and like, you know, sometimes it might work and actually deploy. We built this whole system, very robust system, that actually like I just insert a branch name and click one button and it installs the branch for me on any environment I want. Like it, sorry, I keep looking at his face. He has like amazing shocked reactions. I love it. That's how I'm like going off of how this is going. So we called that tool Sentinel, and it is really handy. I would highly recommend getting some kind of tool in there that makes deploying to specific environments very easy. And one of the biggest ones, and this is my only big thing of text because I wanted to make sure I didn't forget any of this, was formalize every process you can formalize here and make sure everyone knows about it. So all those people who I mentioned before actually know what you formalized and what your process is. So one of the first things that came up was having an actual scheduled on release meeting that every single engineer is invited to. They don't have to come to it, but like if you've got a big thing going out, you might want to be there. And so we scheduled it for 11 a.m. on Wednesdays. Like it is scheduled, everyone knows this is happening, and we are releasing at 11 on Wednesdays, and they know where, and we know who's actually in charge of deploying that day. And then second, we had a lot of dedicated ops members on the release. So this was a rotational cycle. So we always had two members who had ops access doing the release every week. And so we actually grew the members who knew how to do this, the members of engineering who knew how to do this, and made sure like multiple people could actually deploy to production and knew what that process was. And we would change it out every week who would be doing it. So they always got good practice. 3, making sure an engineer from every team was available and watching the release. So this was a big thing. We did a roll call every time we started the release to make sure, because we had 20 development teams at this time. And so if something went wrong in the release, if like a specific feature like all of a sudden wasn't working for users, we had someone who knew that feature available to instantly work on it. Like they weren't off at lunch, they weren't doing anything else. Their focus as soon as the release starts was the release, and if something went wrong, they were available to help. So tracking the responsible team for each blocker to find trends. So once we fix a blocker, we can usually tell what actually caused the issue to happen in our release candidate branch. And so we started actually tracking, is there a specific team who is causing all of these? Like if we had 10 blockers one week, is there a team that caused all 10 blockers, or is it pretty evenly spread out? And we need to know who is causing it so we could start correcting to reduce the number of blockers. We had a release manager that always tracked the go, no-go status of the release leading up to it, so you probably have a lot of different things that need to be up and running and make sure pass before go, like you go out on the release. And so we had someone actually in charge of that, and like it kind of freaked me out like the first week or two I was doing it, whenever the VP of engineering would come up to my desk and I'd feel like, oh, I'm a lonely senior QA person, like you don't need to talk to me. And he would just come up and be like, are we releasing? And I'm like, yes, we're releasing. And it was scary, but I got used to it and it was pretty fun. The release manager also did a lot of pestering, so much so that whenever I started approaching an engineer's desk on like a Tuesday afternoon, like they would kind of like, oh, what is she going to give me? What is she going to do? I think I became like the scariest person in the organization overnight with handing out responsibilities for the release. And then finally, a dedicated Slack channel. We use Slack, you might use something else, to actually keep up on the progress of the release. So those are very important things. I would highly recommend doing them, and these are like the cheapest cost for your organization to do. The next big thing, so we still had to tackle the big regression problem. Like this was a lot of testing. So we did some pretty crazy things here. It was really fun. We got a lot of extra help in our testing efforts for the regression specifically. First, a lot of our regression was pretty monotonous. Like we hire very smart testers at Lucid, and we're very proud of it, and we trust them to do mostly exploratory testing instead of trying to do checklist testing. And so the regression kind of turned into checklist testing, which isn't what we wanted. And so we managed to find another program out there. We used Rainforest QA. You might find something else that actually did a lot of the checkbox testing for us by outsourcing it. And then another thing, and this is the one, like I gave this talk at one other conference, and this is the one that gave me the most looks, was I actually convinced developers to help in the regression testing, because we had 7 testers and 70 developers. And I'm like, there's just no way. If we want to get 2 weekly releases, I can't force 7 people to spend 3 days of every week doing this. And so I sat down with a lot of the lead developers and explained the whole situation and said, can you give me 3 developers every week to help me out? And like somehow I convinced them, and I'm happy to go over that conversation with you guys afterwards because it was really fun. But like once I got one person to say yes to me, I'm like, I can convince anyone, because I convinced the hardest person to get to say yes first. And then I worked my way down to like some of the easiest people. And like it works, and like we actually have gotten to the point now where we don't need it as much, and like I only get 2 developers every week for like 2 hours, and that's all I need, like because we've whittled down the regression so much. Another big thing is automatic Git hooks. So like I said, we wanted to get a couple of our services, not all of our services, because we have a couple of monoliths that are just gigantic that will take some time before they're at true continuous deployment. But we wanted to get a couple of our smaller back-end services at continuous deployment. So we used automatic Git hooks to remind people to what they actually had to do and warn them, like, hey, this is a CD service. Are you sure you want to hit that merge button? Are all of these things, working? And I even reminded people, like, you need to add this person to this kind of pull request, like, because this person knows a lot about this area of code, so you probably really want them on your pull request. So I would get a few of those in there. And another big thing about the extra assistance in our testing is we actually did a lot around automation. If you can, when you're still a small organization, start your automation early. Like, get it going really well and really early. Like, we had automated tests all up to this point, but we didn't really have anyone who was in charge of the maintenance of our automated test suite, which was kind of painful. But we started training someone up. They got really good at it. and our tests got a lot better and a lot more reliable because they had a lot of reputation around our company. Like, whenever you ran our automated testing suite against a branch, like, I don't think it's actually failing. It's just saying but it's kind of flaky. And so we had to make sure everyone trusted those automated tests before we could get here. And I would highly recommend this blog post about flaky tests, the tester's F word. It'll get you a lot of information about how to make more reliable tests. And then finally, communication, like always telling people what you're doing and what is actually working. And so that is what it took. And now we hit our goal on December 1st, not December 31st, which was amazing. Like, once we outlined everything and started implementing all these new things, we managed to hit it even faster than we imagined. And now we release all services to production every single week, and we've been doing that for over 10 months now, which has been absolutely fantastic. And then 15 out of 20 of our services are actually continuously deployed now, like in the truest, in our sense of what continuous deployment is. So if you remember that kind of chart I made before, this is kind of showing like what we do now. So we develop on a branch, and then we also test on the branch because we have the test environments and we have the resources available to get the testing done earlier, which means we don't have to keep creating all these bug fix branches. We can just fix it all on the same branch. And then we can merge that to master. We can cut sprint end. We can regression test it, fix it, and merge it to production. And we can do all of that instead of releasing Thursday at 2 p.m. We managed to find a lot of inefficiencies, and we now release Wednesday at 11 a.m. instead, which is fantastic. But that brings me to the final thing, which is what's next? What's our next big goal? We got to this weekly deployment. The next big thing is definitely we got to break up those monoliths, the giant services. Like, we have one service that I always think of it as one service, but it's actually like 20 codependent, incredibly like together services that cannot go out separately. And then whether or not should we release more than once a week is definitely the next big question. I don't have an answer to that yet. But maybe I will soon. And so we hope that eventually our process can just be develop on a branch, test on a branch, fix the issues on that branch, merge it to master, and then that automatically goes out to production without even really worries. So that is all I have for you today. You can find me on LinkedIn if you want some follow-up. I'm happy to discuss any of the opinions and thoughts I gave today with you at any time. So thank you. I also have business cards if you want to email me. So.